If you've been following the sermons over the last few weeks, you know that we have been spending quite a bit of time thinking about enemies. It's hard to read the first 10 Psalms in the book of Psalms without coming up against the issue of what the psalmist consistently and repeatedly calls either his enemies or the wicked, those forces he seems to be constantly, perpetually surrounded by that are bent on his harm, even his destruction. And I said some weeks ago that for me, for most of us probably, our enemies are most often internal. They are those voices, those testing situations that we struggle with. They are the tendencies at times towards sadness, despair, angst, fear, uncertainty, depression. They are those tendencies towards judgmentalism, towards resentment, bitterness, anger, all those internal forces that seem to incline us towards being somewhat less than the people we know we're called to be. And I think that's true. For most of us in the privileged conditions in which we live, enemy means something inside. But then a few weeks after that, I suggested, quoting Jesus, who said, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." I suggested that perhaps if we love our enemies and pray for those who persecute you, perhaps we don't actually have any enemies. And I've been suggesting that enemy formation is not a particularly helpful way to view the human community, that perhaps the psalmist is not doing us a great service by dividing human beings into those who are for him and those who are against him. Those he calls, as he does in 10 verses of Psalm 10, 10 of 18 verses in Psalm 10, those he calls the wicked, separating himself from them and identifying them as the dark forces of evil at work in the world and bent on his destruction. I suggested that perhaps that isn't the best way to look at the world and the human community, and that when we engage in enemy formation, when we view people as our enemies, it may not be the most healthy and life-giving approach to our relations with others. But since I said that, I've been thinking a lot about enemies, and I fear that my dismissing of the concept of enemies to some degree, or belittling of it, comes really from my position of privilege, my position of power, from my position of living in a world where, for the most part, my needs, my wishes, my wants, and my desires are relatively protected. And then, in fact, for most of my life, I've had people who opposed me a bit. I've had people I thought perhaps were against me. But I have never really lived in a world where there were real enemies waged against me. But that has not been the reality for some people in our history. It is certainly is not the reality for some people in the world today. Children who are taken or sent away from their families to live in a strange and foreign environment that had no respect for their culture, had no desire to allow their practices as people to be continued, who sought only to eliminate their deepest cultural beliefs and their system of faith. those children had enemies. And tragically, those children's enemies were often bishops, priests, nuns, government officials, police. They were people that we place in positions of respect and authority in our society. You may have noticed today that I'm not wearing robes. I'm not even wearing a clerical collar. And you may have thought, well, isn't he sensible? How wise in a church that is now sitting at around 30 degrees. How sensible not to be wearing robes, but that's not the reason. I'm not wearing robes today. I'm not wearing a clerical collar today because today I feel ashamed. I feel ashamed of our history. I feel ashamed to be identified as a priest in an institution that perpetuated grievous injustice, pain, and suffering against innocent people. I feel ashamed for the voices of children silenced that cry now from beneath the surface of the ground, bearing testimony to the horrors that they were caused to suffer. I feel ashamed that, as the psalmist said, the wicked boast of the desires of their heart. In arrogance, the wicked persecute the poor. And I can hear those children in their lifetimes praying to God, let them, the wicked, be caught in the schemes they have devised. I can hear them crying out and praying for justice and longing for relief that never comes. Who could blame those children for wishing, like the psalmist, that those who oppose them might be broken? Who could blame them if they prayed with the psalmist, break the arm of the wicked and evildoers, seek out their wickedness until you find none? Who could blame them for longing for some force, some power, some authority to come to their defense? So I think today, at this time in our history, we need to give the psalmist, who apparently was surrounded by forces that were bent on his destruction, we need to give the psalmist the respect of his feelings. He felt vengeful. He felt angry. He felt abandoned by God. Why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? How could those children shut away in Indian residential schools, their hair cut like Europeans, dressed in uniforms, unable to commune with the land in the way they had been taught by their elders, how could they not have felt that the Lord had abandoned them? How could they not have felt that God had hid himself from their faces? I was asked a while ago why it is, I think, that the Psalms have such a powerful and enduring presence in Jewish and Christian tradition. What is it that gives these Psalms their lasting power in our spiritual tradition? And I think one answer to that question is simply the fact, the reality of their honesty. The psalmist told the truth about how he felt. He told the truth about the ugliness at times of the world and how he felt about that and how he wanted to respond and react. And we need to be willing to hear about the oppression, the wickedness, the pain, and the suffering inflicted by our forebears in this land on innocent, powerless people. We need to be willing to know the truth about our past. Most of you are aware that, of course, that Canada Day is coming, July the 1st, when happily and joyfully, as a rule, we celebrate with great thanksgiving the beauty of this land, the freedom in which we live, and we cherish together the stories of how we have been able to prosper and thrive in this place. But it feels to me as if perhaps this year we might be willing to hit the pause button on our joyful Canada Day celebration. And instead, we might be willing just this year to acknowledge the painfulness of the past, the injustice of the past, the harm done by people in positions of authority, the wicked actions of priests, bishops, nuns, governments, police forces, all of whom contravened the most basic and fundamental dignities of what it means to be human. It's not good enough today to say, well, they knew no better. It's not good enough to say they were acting, they were living out of their own worldview. The fact is, there were people, not many, but a few, there were people who were able to transcend their worldview and see more clearly. And we need to know that it could have been, should have been, might have been possible for people, for our people, to step outside of our cultural blinders and to make different choices, to stop viewing the world so myopically and to look more clearly. But as the psalmist says of the wicked, their eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. They lurk in secret like a lion in its covert. They lurk that they may seize the poor. They seize the poor and drag them off in their net. They stoop, they crouch, and the helpless fall by their might. That is what happened. That is what was done. And the land cries out now that we might join with those who were dragged off, those who died, those whose culture was taken from them, and that we might cry out to God, praying as the psalmist prayed, "Do not, O God, forget the oppressed." But if we're going to pray that prayer genuinely, if we are going to pray that God might not forget the oppressed, we also must be willing to answer that prayer. We must not forget. We must be willing to hear the voices of the oppressed. We must be willing to see the lives of those who are broken. Some of those who were buried in unmarked graves, many of them were children. Many of those children would still be alive today. Their siblings may still be alive today, their cousins, even their aunts and uncles, perhaps even their parents. but they can't hear their voices now. They have been taken from them. Their families have suffered great loss. And we gather together today partly to lament that past. But we don't stand simply wallowing in this brokenness. Our Bishop Anna, in a video that she's posted on Facebook and has sent out to people who are subscribed to receive the video series that the diocese is working on right now, spoke of Parker Palmer's concept of the tragic gap. The tragic gap is that space between the horror of what was, which we must recognize and must acknowledge, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the vision of what might be, the vision of the people we are called to be, the vision of the society we are called to create, the vision of the human community that we seek together to build. And we stand in that gap, not with our great solutions, not with our wise answers, but knowing that we are called to hold the brokenness of the world. The psalmist says to God, "But you do see. Indeed, you note trouble and grief, that you may take it into your hands. The helpless commit themselves to you. You have been the helper of the orphan. You will hear the desire of the meek. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to do justice for the orphan and the oppressed." Not wearing robes, wearing an orange shirt, taking off my collar, it's nothing. But it's a tiny gesture that, like God, I want to hold this trouble and this grief in my hands. I want to receive the pain of this land and the peoples who we displaced when we came to this land. And I want to pray with the psalmist that God might be present to those who suffer and suffered greatly at the hands of our forebears. Amen.